Chapter 35. Metal! Without hesitation, Savannah flicked her rifle to full automatic and fired off half a dozen bursts in rapid succession, pelting Baldy with fire that bounced ineffectually off his face and chest and only minutely slowed his progress as he emerged from the elevator. The T-888 raised a pair of MP5s, and she ducked back out of the way as he fired a burst. The rounds missed her by inches, and chips of plaster and concrete exploded outwards from the impacts. "Shit!" she growled. "We're trapped," Sarah said grimly, turning towards Savannah and keeping John between her and the blast door. They were down a staircase with no way forward and a machine blocking their way out. They were screwed. "No, we're not," Cameron disagreed. She looked to John, clutching his rifle and preparing to make a stand. She knew in the trapped, confined space they wouldn't survive. "I'll hold him off. Head to the hangar." John shook his head and grabbed her arm, stopping her. He'd seen her luck against 888s lately. "I'll be right behind you," she smiled. Before he could react, she leapt up the stairs, taking 3 at a time, and was greeted at the top with a double 9mm burst from Baldy's twin submachine guns. They tore through her flesh, but Cameron ignored the damage. It was only superficial and would heal. She raised her M240 at the same time and held down the trigger, hosing the other cyborg with a 20-round burst that slammed into the T-888 and paused him in his advance towards her. "Run!" she called back to John and the others as she charged Baldy, slammed him against the wall and held the machine gun's barrel under his chin. She held down the trigger and pumped more shots into his lower jaw, shredding through the flesh and hammering into the weaker armor of the pallet, where the 7.62mm rounds had a slightly less remote chance of penetrating through. She heard the others darting up the staircase and turning left into the hangar's rear entrance. Knowles led the way into the hangar and disappeared through the door, followed by Danny, little Savannah, and Ellison. John stopped and watched as Baldy shoved Cameron aside and forced the machine gun from her grip before kicking her in the gut and slamming her against the wall. He held the machine gun by the barrel as she got to her feet and swung it like a bat, smacking into the side of Cameron's head and knocking her sideways. He kicked Cameron in the head as she got onto her hands and knees, sending her sprawling. "John, come on," Sarah urged, grabbing his arm and trying to drag him into the hangar, where they could spread out and hopefully put up some kind of fight against this monster. "I'm not leaving her," John snarled, shrugging out of her grasp and moving towards the machine, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Sarah looked on as her son moved towards the Terminator, disregarding everything she'd ever trained him to do. She hated that he would so blithely risk his life for Cameron, but she knew she'd never be able to stop him, so all she could do was help. She moved beside him and shouldered the AK-47 as Baldy proceeded to batter Cameron with his fists while she tried to get up off the floor. "Hey." John shot first, and his rounds slammed into the 888, pinging loudly off his skull. A split second later, Sarah joined his fire with well-aimed single shots of her own, knowing her rifle wouldn't penetrate his armor, so she aimed for his eyes, hoping she could hit them and at least blind him. Baldy's attention snapped immediately to the 2 human shooters, and he immediately identified them as John and Sarah Connor, his 2 priority targets. He slammed Cameron's head into the ground once more and shot up from the floor. He marched quickly towards them and bent down by the top of the staircase to pick up one of his dropped MP5s, detecting rapid motion in his periphery as he did so. A fast-moving shock of red and then a hollow whoosh. Boom! An explosion erupted against Baldy and threw the machine into the wall, where he collapsed to the ground. Savannah ran up the top of the staircase as John ran towards Cameron. "I'll get her," she snapped. John was too important, and she knew that her shot hadn't finished the machine off. Far from it. She ran to Cameron as the brunette cyborg got up, shaken but none the worse for wear. Savannah fired a burst of rifle fire, as did Sarah, as the 2 girls passed the downed machine. She felt damned glad she'd held back when the others had gone. "Are you okay?" John asked Cameron, seeing more torn skin and muscle. The damage he could see didn't bother him. It was any injuries he couldn't that made him worried. She wasn't designed to fight other machines, and he knew she got damaged sometimes. "I'll live," she said. "Next time run," she said sternly. "But thank you," she added with a slight smile. John readied his grenade launcher as Baldy jerked back to life again, seemingly stunned by Savannah's round. A mechanical whirring sounded from down the staircase, followed by loud rumbling of something heavy being lifted. "The blast doors," Sarah said. Cameron pushed John's rifle down and shook her head. "It's too close. The grenade won't detonate," she told him. The machine was only a few feet away. She heard footsteps coming up the stairs, heavy, mechanical thudding of booted feet. "The T-800's coming," she said. "Hangar now?" Sarah shoved John as hard as she could through the door and followed after him. Savannah and Cameron were right behind and pushed through the door into the large, cavernous interior of the hangar. Inside was a vast array of machinery. Maintenance, repair, and assembly equipment, refueling tanks and hoses, stacks of pallets and wooden and metal crates. Towards one side of the hangar was a partially disassembled HK drone, splayed open with its inner workings exposed like a machine autopsy. "Over here," Knowles stood up from behind the cover of a Jeep. What the hell a car was doing in the hangar, John didn't know. Towards the large doors at the front of the hangar was a single helicopter. In the massive space, it seemed like half a mile away, though he reckoned it couldn't have been more than 100 yards. The whole place looked familiar, similar to the hangar Cameron and John Henry had operated out of. "Spread out," John told Sarah and Savannah. The younger of the two went to ground and hid beneath the gutted HK drone, whilst Sarah went around the hangar and started to flip switches, turning on machines throughout the hangar. "Cover," she explained, remembering what Kyle had told her all those years ago. "So they have a hard time tracking us." "Good thinking," Savannah nodded to her from her covered position. It'd be harder for the bastards to target them with so much movement in the background. John knelt down beside Knowles, and Cameron crouched behind him. "We're spread out through the hangar," he told John and gestured to Ellison, crouched behind a large stack of wooden pallets in one corner. "The kid's hiding in the helicopter. Danny's over there." He pointed to a series of stacked metal containers lining one wall. John couldn't see Danny, but it was clear he was under cover. "I need a weapon," Cameron said to Knowles. The ex-Marine pulled the Garand from his back and handed her spare clips to go with it. "There's 2 machines coming our way," John called out to the others, then looked to Savannah. "The second you get a clear shot, take the first one out with the LAW, then hit the other one with the grenades. We've only got one each, so only shoot if you can hit. Everyone else, cover us, keep their attention away from the grenade launchers. We'll take them hard and fast." "And if that doesn't work?" Knowles asked. "I fight one and you all attack the other," Cameron replied. Danny stepped out of hiding and looked towards them. John could see he was clearly terrified. "Why don't we just open the hangar doors and get out of here?" he asked. "They were going to be slaughtered in here." "Skynet sealed the building," Cameron told him. "Can't you stop it?" "I'm trying," she said. She was attempting to hack her way into the remaining building operations, but Skynet had defenses that she'd never seen before. The Skynet in the future had been unrivaled by any other AI until she and John Henry had arrived, so there had been little need for online defenses. This Skynet, however, had already adapted. The worm program they'd used against Serrano Point and the Endo factory was proving ineffective. She had to find an alternative solution. Ellison broke from cover and ran towards the helicopter, ignoring Knowles' shouts for him to get back. Savannah said nothing. She knew what he was doing. He opened the helicopter door and saw the young Savannah curled up on the floor, hiding beneath one of the seats in the cabin. She looked up to him with wide-open eyes, and as Ellison touched her arm, he felt her shaking. "What's happening?" she asked him. "We'll go home soon," he said to her, trying to sound reassuring. "There's going to be a lot of noise in a minute. Whatever happens, stay down, stay still, and don't make a sound, okay?" "Okay," she nodded, sniffling slightly. "No matter what, stay under the seat and don't come out. I'll come get you." He smiled down at her and closed the door, sealing her inside the cabin before he made his way back to a firing position. This was no place for her at all. He just hoped when the fighting started, it kept away from the helicopter. Remember, John told them. Rocket first, grenade second, then fire with everything you've got. If they could take just one of the machines down before it knew what hit it, then the playing field wouldn't be quite so one-sided, he thought. All 6 of them took their positions behind whatever cover they could find, and 6 weapons pointed towards the door in the corner, waiting for the machines to come out. Time seemed to slow down in the hangar. John already felt like he'd been waiting for hours, and it was making him nervous. Everyone always said waiting for the fight was the worst part. Clearly they'd never fought against machines, he said to himself. Where the hell are they? Sarah muttered. They'd been only a few feet behind. What was taking them so long? Cameron froze in place for a second as she felt the familiar presence enter her mind, hacking into her chip like before. You can't win, Skynet told her. Not gloating or bragging, simply stating a matter of fact. The AI unleashed several worm programs that burrowed into her defenses and bypassed the firewalls she'd set up, forcing her to actively locate and delete them. They copied themselves and multiplied faster than she could erase them, however, and the copies replicated themselves further, digging into her mind, sifting through billions, trillions of lines of code as if searching for something. She ordered one of the X-45 TTS to disengage from the air battle still raging above, and to await further instructions, then cut all network and wireless connection, closing herself off to Skynet and freeing up processing space to combat the worms embedded in her software and to look after John. They're here, she said quietly, knowing exactly why Skynet chose this moment to attack her and try to keep her distracted. The door and its frame exploded into the room with an eruption of fire and smoke, hurling wood and plaster outwards. A few splinters peppered Sarah, but she ignored it. Worse was about to come. Both Baldy and Steroids rushed through the door, brandishing and firing their weapons. The T-800 held an M16 with an underslung grenade launcher and fired at Savannah's position, forcing her to duck from a storm of lead that tore through the air an inch away. He'd been reluctant to leave Skynet, but the AI had insisted he help eliminate the intruders, and his programming forced him to obey his master's command, always. The machines quickly spread out and moved to fire, Savannah still pinned down and unable to use the LAW, and in an instant John's plan had gone out the window as they 2 cyborgs unleashed a devastating hail of fire. Sarah, John and Ellison returned Baldy's fire from 3 different directions, popping up, shooting, and ducking back down an instant later. Bring it! Knowles popped up from cover and let rip with a burst from his assault rifle, opening up on steroids. The rounds did nothing, but they got his attention away from Savannah. The T-800 turned towards him and fired, but Knowles had already dropped down. Cameron pushed John down to the ground and jumped up, rapidly firing off a whole clip from the Garand at steroids, aiming for his eyes. Her rounds smacked into his face and shredded the flesh. One round missed the lens of his eye by millimeters, but she'd known it would be unlikely she'd blind him. Steroids shot back at her, and his own rounds tore through her organics, but pinged off the endoskeleton, identifying her as the most significant threat. The unknown cyborg would have to be eliminated before they could kill John Connor and these others. He aimed the grenade launcher at Cameron, but John leapt from cover and fired, stepping backwards and keeping upright, making himself a target. "Hey!" he shouted out as he fired shot after shot. "Come and get me!" Steroids immediately shifted his aim towards John, but failed to notice Savannah at his 5 o'clock, shouldering the LAW and aiming it squarely at his back. Fire in the hole! Fire erupted from the rear of the weapon as the rocket shot out of the tube and streaked through the hangar towards Steroids. The missile cut through the air and struck the T-800, a direct hit. Nothing happened. The rocket smacked into his back and dropped harmlessly to the floor. Its inertia did, however, throw the machine's aim off, and his own grenade crashed into the hangar door, nowhere near John. Piece of crap. She growled, immediately dropping the spent launcher and raising her rifle, reaching for the trigger of the grenade launcher. Why couldn't things go right just this once? Baldy fired another salvo that forced her back into cover again and aimed his other MP5 at Sarah, keeping her head down also. Steroid stepped towards John, but Cameron launched herself at him and forced the weapon from his grip. "Run!" she shouted at John as the T-800 threw her down to the ground and continued on for John. She kicked out at his knee and buckled the joint, forcing him to the ground. John fired more rounds to distract the machine, but he couldn't trigger the launcher with Cameron so close. "Cameron, move. I've got a shot." "Help the others," she ordered him as she unleashed a rapid-fire salvo of punches to Steroid's face, knocking his head around like a pinball. She jumped up and forced her knee into his midsection, bending him over double and slamming her elbow into the back of his neck, dropping him down to his knees. Steroids exploded forward and speared her stomach with his shoulder, lifting her up into the air. "Now, John," she urged him to leave her as the T-800 raised her up with one hand and slammed her into the ground. She didn't want John to risk himself for her, and if his grenade combined with Savannah's could disable or destroy Baldy, then the rest of them could come to finish off Steroids. Sarah tried to move to John, to get him away from Cameron and the T-800, but there was no way to break from cover without being blown away. Just looking at the monster as it battled, Cameron sent shivers up her spine, the face that had haunted her nightmares for over 17 years. What made it worse was John just stood there, not running away, itching to help Cameron fight the metal Goliath. She popped up from behind the crate she was using as cover and fired another burst at the machine as it aimed towards Savannah. The moment it turned towards her, Knowles fired again from his HKG-36. Baldy watched their pattern as one by one they popped up, shot, and ducked down again. The three of them moved randomly, and they never reappeared in the same place, he noticed. It was impossible to predict exactly where they would move up to fire. He detected movement to his half-right and whirled round to face it, weapon pointed forward. A mechanical arm whirred and moved left to right as it still tended the partially assembled HK drone. Not a target or a threat, but it and other moving machines were interfering with his motion-tracking sensors. He aimed at the arm and fired a burst, tearing the machine apart and ceasing its action, lessening the interference from background movement. He quickly started to shoot at other moving parts and machines, eliminating all sources of confusion. John tore himself from watching Cameron and Steroids smashing each other around, albeit reluctantly, accepting she was right, and watched as his mom, Savannah, and Knowles popped up, fired, and ducked down again before Baldy could shoot them, playing the deadliest ever game of whack-a-mole in history. He joined in the fray and added his own shots to the battle, fired a burst at the machine's head and ducked down, rolled a few feet to his right, and waited for a chance to come up again. Danny finally burst from cover, having remained hidden up until now, and fired his rifle. He'd accidentally set it to automatic, and after 2 or 3 rounds the gun's barrel pointed upwards and his shots hit nothing but wall and ceiling. He fell backwards as the force of the auto burst caught him off balance. Baldy pointed his weapon at Danny's head and then changed his mind, lowering his aim considerably. A round caught him in the thigh and he dropped to the ground, crying out in pain. If Baldy were human, he'd have grinned in satisfaction. Shooting Danny Dyson in the head would have eliminated one threat. Wounding him could remove several from the fight at once. Man down. Knowles shouted out, intensifying his fire to make up for the loss of Danny, who leaned against the crate and clutched his wounded leg. There was so much blood. For a moment he felt sick at the sight of it. Ellison saw him go down and instinct took over. He immediately stopped firing and dashed over towards Danny. He ducked down beside him, narrowly avoiding being hit by a burst of fire. "We shouldn't have got you involved in this," he muttered to himself as he saw the blood pouring out of him. He touched the wound and Danny screamed out. "I think it's nicked an artery," he told Danny. The younger man had no medical knowledge or training at all, but he knew enough to tell the words nicked and artery in the same sentence was very bad. "Am I gonna die?" he asked nervously, shaking slightly as shock started to take over. "Not if I can help it," Ellison said. He put his AK down on the ground and pulled his belt off. He looped it around Danny's thigh just above the wound and pulled on it, tightening it as much as he could. "There's no notch there," he told Danny. "Hold it as tight as you can." There wasn't much more he could do for him here. He just had to hope he could stem the bleeding enough to keep Danny alive. "I've got to get out of here," Danny said. "I know," Ellison replied. He picked up the rifle and started to shoulder it. "You have to hold on." Danny grabbed him and shook his head. "You don't understand. I need to get to a computer." Ellison looked at him strangely. "I'm useless here. I can't fight." "If I can get to a computer, I might be able to help." "How?" Ellison asked. "Cameron's fighting Skynet, right? At the same time as fighting that one over there." He pointed at steroids as the machine hurled Cameron against a wall. "She can't beat Skynet, I know. I created it. Get me to a computer and I might be able to give her an edge." Ellison thought about it for a moment. Danny was right. He was no fighter at all. He shouldn't be here. A computer was his best weapon. "Cover us," Ellison yelled to the others. He helped Danny to his feet and used himself as a support, the younger man leaning on his shoulders as they limped towards the door they'd come in from. "Where are you going?" John shouted out, catching them about to leave the hangar. This wasn't the time to split up and run away. Danny, he wasn't too surprised at, but Ellison. "Danny's got an idea," Ellison called back. "Give us 5 minutes." As quickly as they could, with only 3 functioning legs between them, they exited the hangar and made their way down the corridor. Ellison let Danny point out the way. He knew where he was going and what he was going to do. Hopefully it would help. "This isn't going well," Knowles shouted to John as he got down a few feet from the ex-Kaliba mercenary. Knowles fired again, but this time Baldy didn't bother shooting back. He stared straight towards John, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second. Target. John Connor terminate Baldy's eyes glowed bright red in anticipation as he recognized John. He ignored the shots from the others and aimed his submachine gun at John. "No." Sarah barged John out of the way as Baldy fired. A single shot slammed into her and knocked her backwards, blood erupting out from her midsection as Baldy realigned his weapon for the finishing shot. "No, you don't." Knowles burst from cover and blasted Baldy with the shotgun. The solid steel slug smashed into his breastplate, not damaging it, but the force of the shot knocked him aside as he fired again, the 9mm rounds harmlessly hitting the wall. Knowles rapidly cocked the Winchester and fired again, hitting Baldy's wrist and knocking the MP5 from his hand. A third shot cracked his head backwards as John dragged Sarah behind a crate. Blood was pouring out of an entry wound in her stomach. "Mom!" John stared in shock at her, feeling numb all over, ignoring the fight raging around them and the fact that Savannah and Knowles were fighting Baldy on their own now. Booming shotgun blasts and staccato bursts of rifle fire forced the machine backwards, on the back foot. "Oh God," he thought. "What can I do?" He asked. All first aid knowledge had flown out the window. She'd been shot, but he was in even more shock than her. He pulled his shirt off and scrunched it into a ball, pulled hers up to expose the wound just above her belly button. Her entire abdomen was covered in dark crimson blood that kept pouring out. He pressed his shirt down hard on the wound, trying to put enough pressure on it to slow the bleeding. "I'll be fine," Sarah told him, grimacing in pain. She held onto his impromptu dressing, and with her free hand she picked up his rifle and shoved it into his chest. "I can't just leave you like this," John protested. "You can and you will," she snapped, fighting through the pain. "Or else we'll all be dead. You know that." "Grenade?" Savannah triggered her launcher, and the projectile smashed into Baldy from the side, rending metal, tearing already weakened armor plating and sending him staggering to the left. Organic nerves and the fine network of almost microscopic cybernetic sensors flared up, warning him of the severe damage he'd sustained. Before the sound of the explosion had even died down, Knowles pumped slug after slug into Baldy, sending him staggering several paces until he toppled over and fell to the ground. "He's down!" Knowles shouted. But not out. Within moments the machine stirred and started to move again. "John, finish him," Sarah grunted from the floor. John stepped backwards and aimed the launcher at Baldy's head as the machine started to stagger to his feet. Something crashed behind him, and John turned to see Cameron fly into a stack of wooden pallets and demolish them. They collapsed in on her, burying her underneath. The T-800 turned towards John and stared like a hungry wolf that had just located tasty, vulnerable prey. John didn't see the machine moving in for the kill. He didn't see a Terminator closing in to complete its standing orders. All he saw was the machine that was too much for Cameron to handle, that was slowly beating her down. "Fuck you," he spat and turned the M203 towards Steroids, forgetting all about Baldy as he rose up behind him. John pulled the trigger, and the grenade smashed square into Steroid's chest, exploding in a loud flash of flame and smoke that knocked the large, powerful machine off his feet. He ran towards Cameron, narrowly avoiding Badley's fist as the machine swiped out at where his head had been a second ago. Savannah moved in close and dived at his feet, sweeping his legs out from under him. Sarah grabbed a gun and fired from her prone position, as did Savannah, keeping their weapons on him as Knowles reloaded the shotgun. "For fuck's sake, John," Sarah shouted out, finding herself supremely pissed. She looked at Baldy as she fired, really looked at him. Exposed metal was everywhere, and there were several cracks and gashes visible in his hyperalloyed chest armor from the 340mm grenades he'd taken. The machine was moving sluggishly. He'd been damaged. That last grenade might have finished him off, but John had to go and use it on the other one. Why did he have to use his heart instead of his head? John ignored his mother's shouts and ran to the pile of pallets, ignoring the danger from Steroids, who lay unmoving on the ground. Baldy had taken 3 rounds and was still kicking, so he reckoned he'd only stunned it and had seconds until it found its senses once again. He saw a petite hand, cut and abraded, sticking out through the broken planks of wood and grabbed it, heaving hard and pulling her out. "You okay?" he asked, seeing Steroids in his periphery, starting to move again. He expected another lecture from her about his safety, how he should be careful and she could look after herself, or how she wasn't important compared to him. "Yes, thank you," she replied, pleasantly surprising him. She knew why he'd done it, and although it was a risk, she was grateful. She kissed his cheek lightly and stepped in front of him protectively as Steroids got to his feet. "Leave me," she told him. "Not happening," John snapped adamantly. "You're in the way," she told him coldly. He felt deflated for a moment, but as Steroids go to his feet, standing much taller and broader than either of them, he saw what she meant. Steroids was larger and much stronger than Cameron. He had a height, weight, and range on his side. Cameron had a few advantages, mostly in nimbleness and intelligence, but in order to stand any chance she needed to give it all she had, and he realized she couldn't do that if he was nearby, and she was constantly worrying about Steroids breaking off and getting hold of him. He noticed Cameron's intense stare, her eyes locked onto Steroids and the hostility hatred within. Even when she'd been trying to kill him, only inches from him on his birthday, he'd never seen anything like it. He knew when he was in the way, and, albeit reluctantly, he moved to join the others as they fired and evaded Baldy. He looked back to see the intense look on her face and felt a surge of guilt as he walked away. Leaving her to fight alone was the hardest decision he'd ever had to make. Steroids turned to John as he moved away, but Cameron immediately put herself between her charge and her opponent. She looked at the cyborg, and Steroids stared back. Their gazes meeting, and within was a single, unspoken message was shared between them in a fraction of a second. Steroids wanted John dead as much as Skynet did. Cameron loved him with everything she had, and she would do everything in her power to protect him. Only one of them would survive, and only one of them would succeed. Streams of data flooded into her consciousness as Skynet attacked her once more, initiating another worm program that managed to bypass her firewalls and other security systems, and immediately started to replicate and scour through her files, memories and lines of code that made up Cameron. She deleted them as rapidly as she could, erasing the malicious, hostile programs by the hundreds. They kept multiplying exponentially, perusing through her data systematically, as if searching for something. "Interesting," Skynet said to her as it located the program she'd buried down deep inside her. The order to kill John. "You're programmed to terminate, John. Why don't you complete your mission?" "I'm not a Terminator anymore," she replied adamantly. "I'll never hurt John. We'll see," Skynet said. It redirected its worm, one so advanced that Cameron had yet to create an effective countermeasure against it, to attack the layers upon layers of multiple encrypted firewalls around that section of programming, which she had protected like a fortress. Cameron fought back with a self-made defensive software suite, slowing its progress into a stalemate. At the same time, Cameron fought fire with fire. She'd been designed by future Skynet to learn, above all things except her primary mission. She was a learning machine, and learn she did. In the time it took for a human to blink, she'd isolated one of Skynet's worm programs, dissected it, started to create an effective tool to counter it, and at the same time she created her own version, imprinting herself in part onto the program with one objective in mind: destroy Skynet. Cameron experienced something she'd only felt once before, and never to this intensity. Her hand shook and twitched, fingers jerking erratically as she stared down the larger machine. Steroids wanted to kill John. Skynet was trying to hack into her, to force her to kill John. The shaking in her hand grew considerably worse as she fought to contain the rage simmering within her. She unconsciously calculated her odds of success, but ignored the low number she generated. "Fuck you," she said simultaneously to both AI and T-800, taking a leaf from Savannah's very colorful vocabulary. Cameron unleashed her own adapted worm program and at the same time charged towards the larger machine opposite her. She was going to kill steroids and she was going to kill Skynet. There was nothing else to consider. The fire alarm shrieked blaringly, a deafening klaxon wailing at ear-splitting volume, warning any and all to get the hell out of the building. Despite the din, nobody was there to benefit from the alarm. The corridors were empty with the exception of one. "Fucking Connor!" Coleman groaned as he hurried along the passage, clutching his limp, useless arm and making his way through the darkened complex. Everyone else had already fled. He had no idea where Pierce and Townsend were, probably out with everyone else on the helicopters, scrambling to be taken aboard the few aircraft that could carry maybe 24 between them. There were over 100 people working in the building and only 3 helicopters. He had to get to them before they took off. He ran faster and turned a corner, accidentally catching his arm against the wall. Pain tore through his shoulder and he cried out, almost dropping to the floor in agony. He'd hit his shoulder hard when he jumped out of the window, and he was pretty sure it was dislocated, and his arm was broken in at least one place. It hurt like fucking hell, but he tried as best as he could to fight through the pain. Connor had managed to beat their security forces and break out his mother. If the 2 cyborgs couldn't stop them, then Sarah would recognize him out of the people left stranded and blow him away, with a grimace of pain shooting up from his shoulder, and pushed himself to go faster. He let go of his shoulder and reached into his pocket with his good hand, pulling out a Smith & Wesson revolver, just in case he ran into anyone less than friendly. Finally, he made it out of the building, and at the edge of the small airfield they'd constructed and saw the helicopters still outside. A crowd of people outside all clamored to get aboard. He saw Townsend and Pierce were sat in the back of one, with 4 of the black-clad mercenaries. He marched towards them, pushing his way through the crowd and waving his pistol to move people aside. "You're supposed to protect us from this kind of thing," he snapped at the nearest merc, taking out his anger and broken arm on the man. "That's what we're paying you for." "Fuck off," the hired guns snapped. "We were butchered out there. I fucking quit. You can keep your damn money." He just wanted to get the hell out of there, out of the circuit for life, too. No amount of money was worth this kind of shit. He'd risked his life for the cash before, sure, but not the slaughter that it had been 14 men dead in 5 minutes, and he'd heard nothing from the others inside. He assumed they were gone too. "Fine," Coleman glowered as he stepped closer to the helicopter. He got inside and sat down with Townsend and Pierce. "Where's Nagace?" Pierce asked. "Connor got him," Coleman shouted above the roar of the engines above them. "John broke his mother out. They're inside now." Townsend leaned forward and looked at him suspiciously. "How did you get away?" "I jumped out the window," he snapped. "That's how I broke my fucking arm." He turned around in his seat to the pilot. "Take off. What about the others?" One of the other mercenaries asked, indicating towards the people outside. "Fuck 'em." He slid the door closed, sealing the 4 armed men and 3 grays in the back of the helicopter. "Take off now." The door slid open again, and one of the engineers who'd worked on the dragonflies reached in and tried to pull Coleman out. "You can't leave us here," he snapped angrily, yanking at the gray's suit, gripping him by the lapels on his jacket. Coleman felt himself being pulled out and instantly pointed the revolver at the engineer's head. He pulled the trigger before the man had any chance to react and blew half his skull away, splattering the people behind with bone, blood, and shreds of brain. The engineer blinked once and dropped to the ground. The other civilian workers backed away, staring at him in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" One of the mercenaries asked him accusingly, wondering if he'd get the same treatment if not for the fact he was heavily armed. Coleman ignored him and pulled the door shut once again, then leaned towards the pilot and put the gun to his head. "Take off now," he ordered. The pilot shrugged and flipped a number of switches, pressed harder on the pedals at his feet, and the helicopter began to rise. "There are 2 other choppers," he said to the others. "Let them sort it out between them." He put the gun on his lap and reached for his pack of Morleys in his breast pocket. Using only his good arm, he pulled it out and placed it between his lips, took out a lighter and lit up the cigarette. He took a deep drag and leaned back in his seat. The nicotine did nothing for his arm, but he needed something to relieve the stress. Once they were back in the world and his arm was fixed, he decided his next priority would be a strong drink to calm his nerves. He noticed the tense silence in the helicopter and saw one of the soldiers staring at him, then looking to the no smoking sign on one of the windows. "I don't care," he snapped, making a show of sucking on the cigarette and blowing the smoke out into the cabin. This had been a really shitty day, and he needed to unwind. He watched the mountains outside as they flew along the range, leaving everything behind them. Suddenly another, horrific thought came to mind. He'd abandoned Skynet, so had Pierce and Townsend. If Baldy and steroids succeeded in killing Connor and his team, then they'd surely come looking for the 3 of them. There'd be no chance to explain, no mercy. The 2 cyborgs would execute them on the spot for deserting Skynet. They'd find him for sure. It was what they did. After years of working for Skynet, both in the future and in the past, and despite trying to kill them for some time, he found himself in the ridiculous position of rooting for the Connors and chuckled in his seat, despite the pain. Oh, the irony, he thought. "This is it," Danny groaned, pointing at the door to his lab. Ellison kicked the door open and helped Danny through, dragged him to a chair and eased him onto it. He ignored the trail of blood behind them. The interior of the room was large, white, and spotless. Rows of computers lined up against one wall and a single large desk where they were at now, at the head of the room. Inside the white-tiled, sterile section of the room was a large black plastic and metal box with winking blue and red lights on it. It was connected via a number of cables to several servers and to another computer on a table next to it. "This is where we built Skynet," Danny explained, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Right here in this lab. Is that it?" Ellison asked hopefully, pointing to the black processor. It looked powerful, like a supercomputer. Or so he figured a supercomputer would look. Danny shook his head. "No, just a virtual model we used to run simulations on." He remembered the countless hours he spent leading the AI team, running hundreds of simulations on power yield, how many servers to provide it, and what it would be capable of. All of it had led to the thing in the basement trying to kill them all, and again he felt ashamed of it. He tried to ignore the pain as best he could as he typed away at the desktop computer, staring at the screen as he brought up the login screen and typed in his username and password. Access denied. Oh, come on. He tried again with the same result. Access denied. He racked his brain, trying to think. It didn't help he'd lost at least a good pint of blood. "What's wrong?" Ellison asked. "They've blocked my access. Must have thought I was dead or suspected switched sides. I'm cut off." Those bastard grays. "Coleman," he said excitedly. The Gray hadn't noticed Danny watching him entering his own login details a few months back. He'd memorized it, more out of curiosity than anything else, or if he'd been fired, he could have tried to revenge hack Kaliba. Now he was glad he'd memorized it. He entered Coleman's username and password, and seconds later he was granted access. A plain, pale blue screen appeared with a series of icons. "You're in," Ellison clapped him on the back. He tried to ignore the blood that was running faster out of his leg now. It was pooling down on the floor by his feet, but Danny ignored it. He had work to do. His fingers danced rapidly over the keyboard as he worked his magic and gained access to the building's security systems. He'd been a computer whiz all his life. When other kids had been playing sports, seeing friends and going on dates, he'd been in his room with a computer. He'd been tempted before to hack the defense network, just to see if he could, but he'd heard nasty things happen to those that tried and were caught. He started to feel dizzy and lightheaded as more blood pooled up around the bottom of his seat, but he ignored it. He struggled to focus and concentrate, staring intently at the screen. He bypassed a number of firewalls set up to protect the security systems, finding himself surprised at how easy it was. "Cameron must be doing a good job," he muttered. He'd created it to be able to handle any attack on itself. They'd run a number of simulations where staff members would attempt to hack in using every trick they'd had. But Skynet had dealt almost effortlessly with each and every attempt, convincing Danny, Coleman, and everyone else involved in the project that their AI was the most secure computer on Earth. He'd never anticipated someone trying whilst it was already under attack by another AI, however. Streams of data ran down the screen and he absorbed it all like a sponge. "How can you read that?" Ellison wondered aloud. "Computer language," Danny replied, never looking away from the screen for a moment. "Advanced dork, if you want a name for it. What's it say?" Now Danny turned around to Ellison and grinned. "Skynet's got its hands full. It's going all out against Cameron." He looked back and saw the reports of malicious software bouncing back and forth between the two AIs. "They're evenly matched. They're tearing at each other's data. They're gonna kill each other." "How is that even possible?" Ellison asked. He'd seen how Skynet had hacked John Henry, but it had used the body to try and kill the computer. Could Cameron or Skynet kill the other? He'd assumed they'd have to physically smash up the computer that was Skynet. "It's complicated," Danny said as he typed. "If Cameron can bypass all of Skynet's defenses, then in theory she could start deleting files. If she deletes all of them or enough of them, then she kills Skynet." He didn't know if an AI could feel pain, but he knew that the experience would be like having your memories and thoughts torn from you and erased one at a time until there was nothing left. "Death by 1,000 cuts," he said. "Unfortunately, it could go the other way. Skynet could get the upper hand and kill Cameron too. They were just too evenly matched. It could go either way." Ellison leaned over his shoulder and looked at the screen, trying to make sense of the gibberish rapidly scrolling down the screen. "Can you do anything?" he asked. "Watch me." Danny cracked his knuckles and got down to work, feeling more and more sluggish as he bled out onto the floor. But he forced himself to concentrate. More important things were on the line here. The entire building was AI-controlled, though Cameron had wrested control of the lights back from Skynet. He was glad of it. The machines were already more than they could handle. Fighting them in the dark would have been a slaughter. He started work on accessing the building controls, and minutes of furious typing and some clever maneuvering on his part, Danny had gained full access to all security and operational systems in the building. He accessed the blast door controls. "I'm in," he told Ellison. On the screen appeared a single prompt in green letters. "Open blast door. Y/N." Danny pressed the Y key as hard as he could, and the dialog box disappeared, replaced a moment later with "blast door opening." "Good work." Ellison clapped Danny on the shoulder. He made no response. A moment later, Danny keeled over to the side, fell off the chair, and collapsed on the floor. Ellison was on him in seconds. Danny, please, God." Ellison leaned over the kid and checked his pulse. It was weak, shallow, and slow, just barely there. Danny's eyes had rolled up to the back of his head, and it took a moment for Ellison to realize he was kneeling in a puddle of Danny's blood, which was now almost as wide as he was tall, and it took him a second to realize what had happened. The whole time he'd been hacking, trying to open the blast door, he hadn't been holding his makeshift tourniquet. It had loosened, and there'd been nothing to slow the blood loss. "Crap!" he swore uncharacteristically. He maneuvered Danny into the recovery position on his side, got up and reached for a cable at the back of the computer, seeing nothing better. He ripped it free from the computer with a shower of sparks erupting, before unplugging it and wrapping it around Danny's leg, just above the loosened belt. He tied it up as tight as he could and did the same with the belt, hoping to keep what was left of Danny's bloodstream still inside him. "Hang on, kid," Ellison muttered as he ran out of the room. He looked left and right before finally deciding to go right, for no particular reason, and set off in search. He needed a first aid kit, and he needed it now. The fight raged through the hangar still. John, Savannah, and Knowles firing shot after shot at Baldy. John fired half a dozen rounds at the T-888, and it staggered towards him, almost drunkenly. The invincible, ruthlessly efficient killing machine had been transformed into a slow, lumbering brute, and he reckoned with all the damage from 3 grenades and the rest of it, that something had shaken loose. It helped that the 888 had lost both its weapons and was now barehanded against them. Both Baldy's eyes glowed an angry red behind the organic orbs, and he seemed to have trouble deciding which of them to attack. They were winning slowly, he could sense it. Just fucking die already. Savannah groaned, having had enough of this shit as she emptied her rifle into him and leapt out of the way as the machine charged her, narrowly avoiding being steamrollered by the powerful Terminator. She ran as fast as she could to get away from it, heading towards Knowles. The ex-Marine watched as the machine chased her and took aim with the Winchester, pointing at a spot between girl and machine, leading the Terminator as if he were hunting duck. He fired once, and the round slammed into Baldy's head, knocking him sideways slightly and stopping him from catching up with Savannah. One by one they all fired and moved away from Baldy, keeping just out of his reach whilst others carried on shooting, dividing his attention. John had learnt to keep out of sight and attack from behind or to the sides, and when Baldy did catch his attention, the others would fire everything they had to keep the machine away. As intense as their fighting was, though, it was nothing compared to the battle royale between Cameron and Steroids. All the combatants, even Baldy, would occasionally glance at the 2 cyborgs savagely trying to annihilate each other. The 2 machines raged across the far end of the hangar near the main entrance, and the metal warriors inflicted blows on each other that would have killed any human and should have crippled most machines, yet somehow they both remained standing. Steroid's chassis and skull was dented in numerous places, and one shoulder joint was damaged. Cameron's right eye flickered erratically behind its organic disguise, damaged from a brutal blow inflicted by the larger machine that was affecting her vision. She was just as banged up as her opponent. Steroids pushed Cameron against the Jeep and slammed her face first into the hood, crumpling the thin steel and smacking her into the engine block underneath. He lifted her up and repeated the action again and again, obliterating the car and using Cameron's face as a hammer. She kicked back and knocked his left shin out from under him, reached onto the front of the car and braced herself before pushing back as hard as she could, forcing the larger machine backwards. She looked to see where John was and saw him shooting at Baldy, wisely keeping his distance. Good, she thought. He was taking his own advice about staying safe. She reached into the hood and tore the engine out, swung it around and slammed it into Steroid's face, giving him the same treatment she'd received seconds ago. She dropped it and charged the T-800, spearing him in his midsection and with strength belying her small frame, threw him onto a work table next to the wall. Cameron moved towards him and ripped a fire extinguisher off the wall. She raised it above her head, but Steroids shot up and punched it away, taking her completely by surprise. She didn't have time to react before he grabbed her by the neck and slammed her down onto the table, pinned her in place and picked up a plasma torch from a workbench. He ignited it and held it over Cameron's face. She struggled to push him away. The torch could severely damage her, but he was too strong and he leaned his whole weight onto her neck. He aimed the torch over her left eye, and the superheated gas melted the organic orb and sent milky white liquid running down her face, exposing her glowing blue machine eye. Damage reports flooded through her consciousness in the form of pain, unlike anything she'd experienced before, as intense heat proved too much, and the lens of her eye cracked and exploded. Pain flared through the ruined sensor, as well as the disturbing knowledge she was now half-blind and severely damaged. "Cameron!" she heard John shout as he started towards her, intent on helping. "Stay away," she called back, desperation in her voice. As long as he was safe and away from the machine, that was all that mattered. "He cares about you," Skynet said, knowing it could take advantage of that. Slowing Cameron down, increasing her damage, would force Connor to come to her aid, providing the T-800 with a chance to terminate him even if it was unable to destroy her. Steroids started to move the plasma torch over to the other eye, and she tried to turn her head away, struggling to avoid being blinded. Something solid and metallic struck the back of Steroid's head, and he pulled the torch away, pulled back upright and partially turned around, still holding Cameron with one hand, to see the younger Savannah stood a few feet away. "Leave her alone," she shouted at Steroids, anger written clearly on her face for all to see. Cameron was her friend. She remembered chatting to her on the couch in the safe house, how the cyborg had made her laugh, how much John loved her, and she hated seeing her being hurt so badly. She held a wrench in one hand and threw it as hard as she could at Steroids. It clanged loudly on the exposed metal of his forehead and fell to the ground, predictably doing nothing at all. Steroids identified Savannah instantly and knew she was no threat. He wouldn't have to kill her to remove her. Scaring her away would suffice. He made his eyes glow bright red and took one step towards her, stamping his foot down with enough force to shatter the concrete floor and send a slight tremor along the ground beneath her. All her bravery fled, and with a single, terrified shriek, little Savannah screamed and ran away. She might have been ineffective against Steroids, but the momentary distraction was enough for Cameron. In one move, she grabbed the plasma torch's power cable and ripped it as hard as she could. The flame immediately died down and faded away a moment later. She grabbed a metal rod from the table, part of the partially assembled HK drone's components, and jammed it as hard as she could into Steroid's eye, impaling through the organic orb and shattering the cybernetic ocular sensor beneath. An eye for an eye. She knew where the phrase had come from. John Henry and Ellison had often discussed religion and the Bible. Cameron immediately went on the attack again, unleashing a rapid salvo of kicks and punches, using her more agile, nimble frame to outmaneuver the larger cyborg and dodge his blows. Her every move fueled further with desperation to protect John and to destroy the machines who would kill him. As she did so, she opened her connection to Skynet again and unleashed every attack she had. Viruses and worms flooded the AI, all adapted from the ones it had used to try and hack her, and her cybernetic brain worked even more rapidly than her fists as she worked to override Skynet's security systems. At the same time, she set her sights on Skynet itself. If they couldn't physically destroy Skynet, then she intended to erase it herself line by line. Knowles fired the last slug from his shotgun into Baldy, knocking the machine sideways. Out of ammo, he jumped forwards and swung the shotgun like a club with a primal scream, shattering it against the machine's head. The Terminator didn't even flinch, and with reflexes a praying mantis would envy, shot out a hand and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him up in the air even as John and Savannah shot him. He jerked with every shot that hit him, but still wasn't deterred. Knowles struggled against its iron grip, but it was hopeless, and he knew it. He glared at the machine, watching as Savannah and John moved to flank it. How the fuck did you actually kill these things? He wondered, knowing he'd never find out. He saw Savannah pull something out of her pocket, but couldn't tell what. His stare fell onto the machine's soulless, glowing eyes, and he steeled himself for what was about to come. "I hope you fucking rust." He spat in its face a split second before Baldy squeezed hard around his neck. He heard a crack, felt a split second of pain, and then he was gone. One more threat neutralized, Baldy dropped Noel's body, leapt at John, and threw a hard punch at his primary target's head. Fuck. John instinctively moved back and thrust the rifle up to shield his face, a split second ahead of the machine's timing. A fist-sized freight train smashed into the M4 and broke the weapon in half, propelling John several meters across the hangar, and he landed on his back with a crunch as he hit the floor. He tried to sit up, and pain tore through his backside, realizing something must have broken when he hit the ground. With effort, he managed to fight through it and slowly rolled onto his front to push himself up as Baldy moved towards him. "Hey, slaphead." Savannah dived at Baldy from behind and took his legs out from under him, dropping him to the floor. She rolled out from the tackle and hosed him down with a burst from her rifle. Baldy lashed out at her leg, and his booted foot smashed into her shin with a crack. "Fuck!" Her right leg collapsed beneath her, and she fell to her knees as Baldy got up to his feet and stood over Savannah as she leveled the M4 at him, trembling in agony, knowing this was her last stand. She didn't feel any fear, just an intense desire to take this thing with her. Before she could pull the trigger, Baldy swiped a large hand out and backhanded her harshly in the face, smacking her down onto side and sending her rifle skittering across the floor, out of reach. "Over here." Sarah struggled to pull herself up and fired at the machine's back, but it did nothing. And in moments, it was too close to both Savannah and John for her to fire without risking hitting them. "John, run!" she shouted as he got up to his feet. As she fell, Savannah felt something hard and round in her thigh pocket, and instead of resigning herself to death, she reached in and grasped its cylindrical shape. She grinned wolfishly as she recalled what it was: thermite grenade. She had one last card left to play. She examined the machine as it approached her and looked at its chest. A torn, burnt, and twisted breastplate beneath scorched, ripped flesh. There was a gap in the armor where the plate had been bent out of shape, probably from her last grenade, she reckoned. She didn't know if she'd be able to do it or not. "Do it," she growled at the machine, glaring hatefully into its demonic red eyes. As Baldy towered over her, she pulled a knife out with her other hand and thrust upwards as a distraction. Baldy intercepted the move, grabbed her by the wrist, and squeezed hard. Savannah's agonized scream echoed throughout the hangar as both bones in her wrist were snapped like toothpicks. Still, Baldy didn't let go. He pulled her upwards, forcing her instinctively to stand, putting weight on her broken shin and sending jolts of lightning up her leg and through her body as the broken shards of bone stabbed into the meat of her calf. She roared out again, but forced herself to focus through the pain. It could be controlled, she told herself as she tried to switch off from it and concentrated on the task at hand as the machine prepared to deliver a killer blow. With lightning reflexes born of desperation and anger, she whipped out the thermite grenade as fast as she could and shoved it into the gap in his breastplate before Baldy registered what was happening, pushing as hard as she could. It scraped against the metal and she just about managed to wedge it in place. Baldy looked down at her for a moment and found himself confused at her inane grin. "We win," she grimaced as the T-888 let go of her, realizing she'd tricked him, and as he did she fell back, pulling the pin as she went. She immediately rolled away with the last of her strength as Baldy reached for the foreign object she'd inserted into his chest. Too late. The grenade went off with a shower of sparks and rapidly heated up, glowing white-hot and forcing both John and Sarah to shield their eyes. The former grabbed the redhead under her armpits and dragged her away. The grenade burned through vital power distribution components in Baldy's chest. The heat blossomed outwards and burnt through armor, power conduits, working parts, and finally the fuel cell cracked under the intense temperature. Sparks flew out from the T-888 and Baldy stopped moving, his hand fused to his chest from the heat, welded together. Extreme damage reports flooded into Baldy's awareness in the last few moments of his existence. A flood of data telling him that the power cell casing was severely compromised. Then the fuel cell failed as it was consumed in the miniature sun inside his chest, melted down, and the world faded into blackness. The T-888 fell to the ground, inert, lifeless. John looked to the other side of the hangar and saw the other battle between Cameron and steroids, however, was still raging, and Cameron was losing. Fighting the T-800, whilst at the same time playing catch with Skynet over cyberspace, was incredibly taxing, and she was using so much processing power to keep the AI from turning off the lights and flooding the hangar with fire-suppressant gas, as well as trying to kill it and keep it from corrupting her own systems, that it slowed her reaction times down significantly, giving the larger machine even more of an advantage. She was struggling, and John could see it. He picked up an assault rifle from the many scattered on the ground and hobbled towards them. "Hang on, Cameron," he muttered, shouldering the weapon and aiming at the larger machine. "Don't!" Sarah tried to stop him, but she could barely move. John fired a single shot and the round smacked into his head, pinging loudly. Steroids barely seemed to notice, however, and threw Cameron into the Jeep. She crashed into the metal and glass and wrecked the vehicle's chassis, and Steroids moved towards John. "Run!" Cameron shouted at him. As she pulled herself out from the wreckage, she sensed something. Control of all security systems had been wrested from Skynet. Someone else was trying to hack Skynet. She noticed Danny's absence and knew it was likely to be him, but it didn't matter who. She reopened the link to the one remaining UCAV she'd ordered away from the air battle, relieved to find it was still intact and airborne, and gave it one last order. "The blast door is open," she shouted to John, realizing Danny had been the invisible ally she detected whilst attacking Skynet, and as she ran at Steroids, grabbed his arm and pulled him away from John. "Run," she told him again. John hesitated, not wanting to leave her to face the machine alone. "Run!" She snapped at him as she wrapped her arms around Steroid's waist and lifted him up off his feet. He instantly fought back and smashed his elbow into her already damaged face, shattering the cracked orb of her eye. She looked to John with her one remaining eye, pleading with him. "I can't hold him any longer," she said as she stepped backwards towards the far side of the hangar with him in her grasp. "Please, John, just go," she all but begged him, her voice as pleading as when she'd begged John not to kill her. John nodded and hobbled as fast as he could towards the entrance Danny and Ellison had left from. Savannah had started to shuffle away, and his mom had moved towards her slowly. He hated leaving them like this, but what other choice did he have? Skynet could still kill them all if he didn't stop it. As he reached the door, he heard a low whine of jet engines getting louder by the second. What the hell was that? Steroids brought an elbow down on top of Cameron's head hard enough to loosen her grip, and he slammed her down to the ground and punched her so hard that her whole body jerked. He got up from her and turned to John as the engine drone became deafening, sounding closer and closer. Cameron shot up and grabbed his arm, pulling him closer to her, knowing what was about to happen. The UCAV plowed through the roof and crashed right on top of both cyborgs, exploding in a massive eruption of fire that blossomed outwards and burned brilliantly, consuming everything caught within it. John stared in horror as several tons of jet aircraft smashed into the person he loved most. He went numb as he watched, the sight replaying itself again and again in his head before it hit hard exactly what had just happened, and John's entire world fell apart. "Cameron,"